Hi everyone. Well, I have a fun Easter story for us today. It's called The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Earlier, I was talking about how there was a naughty bunny who snuck into the garden and was eating important things, just like in our poem of the week this week. But he didn't listen to what his mama said. So this is a great, what we would call old story, an old-fashioned story tale that actually was written in another country called England. And Beatrix Potter, if you listen to her stories on the YouTube or anything, you'll notice her voice sounds a little bit different. So Mrs. Oberg's going to read in her regular voice, but let's read this fabulous story about The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Now, remember, Peter gets into some mischief because he doesn't listen. So let's hope we're making all right choices at your houses these days. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go out into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I am going out." Oh, she told them to be not in any mischief. Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. And currants are little berries that you can find in the trees or in the forest sometimes. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane and gathered blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. Ooh, now let's think about, in our poem it said, bunnies like to eat things. Let's see what Peter likes to eat from the garden that he shouldn't be in. First, he ate some lettuces, and then some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. So we know bunnies must like to eat lots of vegetables, right, kindergarten? But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" And the rabbit is kind of being like a little thief, isn't he? He's taking the food from Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and another amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have gotten away altogether if he had not unfortunately ran into a gooseberry net, and the large buttons on his jacket got caught. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, and it was quite new. Think his mom was right when she said you shouldn't go into Mr. McGregor's garden? Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears. But his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows who flew to him with great excitement and implored him to exert himself, which means they said, "Come on, Peter, keep going, don't quit, don't let Mr. McGregor catch you." Mr. McGregor came up with a large sieve, which he intended to pop on top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in the nick of time, leaving his jacket behind him. Can you just kind of feel that excitement? And rushed into the tool shed, and he jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water inside. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over and carefully look under each flower pot. Is Peter in the flower pot? Persistently, Peter sneezed. Kerchoo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and he tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out the window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was too tired of running after Peter. So he went back to his work in the garden. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright. Can you just imagine how Peter's feeling right now? Trembling like, oh, what's going to happen to me? Also, he was very damp from sitting inside that water can. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all around the garden. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him, and Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his watering cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish, and she sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail would twitch as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. You might know that cats and rabbits, not such a good mix. Cats would be the predator and rabbits would be the prey. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scratch, scratch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out, climbed upon a wheelbarrow, peeped over it, and the first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned toward Peter, and beyond him, he saw the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go straight for that gate. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him out of the corner of his eye, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last on the wood outside the garden. Look at that picture, boys and girls. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him until he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down on the nice soft sand of the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that he had lost in a fortnight. I'm sorry to say that Peter was not doing very well that evening. Can you see Peter laying way back there? I bet he's feeling pretty exhausted and probably a little bit sad he didn't listen. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea. She gave a dose of it to Peter, 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end. So, fun story about Peter Rabbit. I bet lots of you have heard it before. And a good lesson. We need to listen. We need to make sure we're doing what we're asked to do so we don't get into some troubles. Peter got pretty lucky. All right. Thanks for listening, guys.